What would you do if the most powerful man in the city had been secretly watching your every move for weeks? That's exactly what happened to 25-year-old Leah Carter at exactly midnight, when her world shattered with 7 simple words written in fresh blue ink. "Whoever you are, stop touching my books." Her hands trembled as she stared at the note tucked inside the leather-bound copy of Wuthering Heights. The handwriting was unmistakably elegant, unmistakably authoritative, and unmistakably that of CEO Remington Hayes himself. What began as an inspirational evening among her beloved books had just become her worst nightmare. Inside the sprawling Hayes mansion, where million-dollar art adorned every wall and crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across marble floors, the night shift belonged to the invisible. Leah moved through the opulent rooms like a ghost, her cleaning cart wheels whispering against polished surfaces. At 25, this shy girl was a literature graduate drowning in student debt, working the graveyard shift because it was the only job that paid enough to keep her tiny apartment. The mansion's owner, tech billionaire Remington Hayes, was known for his razor-sharp intellect and ruthless business decisions. His company, Hayes Tech Solutions, had revolutionized artificial intelligence, making him one of the youngest self-made billionaires in history. But tonight, as Leah stood frozen in his private library, she realized she had crossed a line that could destroy everything she'd worked to build. The library had become Leah's sanctuary during those lonely midnight hours. Surrounded by thousands of books worth more than most people's yearly salary, she had begun leaving her own thoughts tucked between the pages. Literary analyses written on scraps of paper, heartwarming conversations with authors who had been dead for centuries, connections between texts that nobody else seemed to notice. She wrote about Emma Bovary's desperate search for meaning, about Jay Gatsby's impossible dreams, about characters who yearned to transcend their circumstances, just as she did. She had convinced herself that these quiet moments of intellectual freedom were harmless, that they were her secret rebellion against a world that saw her as nothing more than someone who emptied trash cans and scrubbed floors. But now, staring at that angry blue ink, she realized how dangerously naive she had been. As panic flooded through her veins, Leah fumbled to replace the book with shaking hands. That's when the security speaker in the corner crackled to life, making her jump so violently she nearly dropped the volume entirely. "I see you, Miss Carter." Remington Hayes's voice filled the library like thunder, calm and controlled, and absolutely terrifying. Her heart hammered against her ribs as the full reality hit her. He had been watching. He knew her name, and he had been observing her midnight visits all along. Somewhere in this mansion, he was watching her through cameras she'd never noticed, studying her every move like a specimen under a microscope. What this shy girl was about to discover would change everything she thought she knew about power recognition and the invisible barriers between different worlds. The next morning brought no relief from Leah's terror. She had barely slept, replaying that moment when Remington Hayes's voice had cut through the library's silence like a blade. She'd stammered an apology to the empty air and fled, but the damage was done. Now facing another shift, she wondered if security would be waiting to escort her out. Her tiny studio apartment felt like a prison cell as she got ready for work. Student loan notices covered her kitchen table like accusatory stares. Stanford literature degree, summa cum laude, and here she was scrubbing toilets for minimum wage. The irony wasn't lost on her that she'd spent 4 years analyzing the class struggles in Victorian novels, only to find herself living them in modern-day Seattle. Her professors had praised her thesis on economic invisibility in Dickens. If only they could see her now invisible in every way that mattered. The bus ride to the Hayes mansion took her through the city's stark divides, from her cramped apartment building in the International District past the gentrifying neighborhoods where coffee shops charged more for a latte than she made in an hour, finally arriving at the exclusive Medina enclave, where tech billionaires lived behind gates and manicured hedges. Each mile reminded her how far she was from belonging anywhere near Remington Hayes's world. Carter. The sharp voice belonged to Pauline Ross, the cleaning team manager who ruled the night shift with vindictive precision. At 35, Pauline had clawed her way up from junior cleaner by ensuring no one beneath her ever rose too high. She cornered Leah near the service elevator, her pale eyes glittering with malicious satisfaction. "I heard you were snooping around in Mr. Hayes's library last night." Pauline sneered, stepping uncomfortably close. "Think reading a few books makes you someone special. Think it makes you better than the rest of us." Leah's cheeks burned with shame as she stared at the marble floor, unable to meet Pauline's contemptuous gaze. "I was just doing my job." "Don't lie to me," Pauline snapped. "You think I don't see how you linger in there? Touching those books like they're precious treasures. I've been watching you, Carter. Taking twice as long as anyone else, running your fingers over those fancy covers like you're caressing a lover. Wake up, honey. You're a cleaner, a nobody, and nobodies don't get to play pretend in billionaire libraries." The words hit Leah like physical blows. She'd heard variations of this speech her entire life, from professors who looked right through her because she worked 3 jobs to pay tuition from classmates whose parents bought their way into internships while she applied for hundreds of positions only to be rejected. The message was always the same: know your place. From the shadows came a calm, weathered voice that cut through Pauline's venom like warm honey. "Sometimes," said Dane Thompson, emerging with the quiet dignity of his 70 years, "the quietest ones write the most important chapters." Pauline's face flushed with irritation. "Mind your own business, old man." But Dane's kind eyes met Leah's with unexpected warmth. "I've been watching these hallways for 15 years, young lady. I've seen plenty of people come and go. CEOs, politicians, celebrities. They all pass through here eventually. But I've never seen someone handle those books the way you do. Like they're cherished friends instead of just objects. Like each one contains a universe worth exploring." His words were a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. Dane had noticed her care, her reverence. Maybe she wasn't as invisible as she thought. That evening, despite her fear, Leah found herself drawn back to the library. The pull was magnetic. Partly terror, partly desperate hope. Her hands shook as she approached the shelf where she'd left her note the night before. There, tucked inside Jane Eyre, was something that made her breath catch entirely. A note in elegant handwriting read, "Your analysis of Shakespeare's sonnets is sharper than most scholars I know. Please don't stop sharing your insights. Someone is listening." For the first time in months, Leah smiled. A real smile that reached her eyes and warmed the cold places in her heart. She pulled out her pen and began writing back, pouring her thoughts about literary symbolism onto a scrap of paper with the same care she'd once given to college essays. What started as terror was transforming into something unexpectedly inspirational. A connection with someone who valued her mind. But Pauline had been watching from the doorway, her expression darkening with each passing moment. "Don't think the CEO actually notices you," she hissed, causing Leah to jump. "Men like him don't see girls like you. You're help, Carter. That's all you'll ever be. He's probably just amusing himself watching the poor little cleaning girl pretend she matters." Yet even as Pauline's words stung, they felt hollow against the warmth of that handwritten note. Someone was reading her thoughts. Someone understood. And for this shy girl who had felt invisible for so long, that recognition was like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Margie Hayes. Remington's 58-year-old assistant observed these interactions with the sharp perception of someone who had spent decades reading people and politics. She noticed Pauline's obvious jealousy, Leah's quiet intelligence, and the subtle shift in her employer's demeanor whenever the young cleaner's name came up in conversation. There was something heartwarming about watching this connection develop even from a distance. In 30 years of working for powerful men, she'd never seen one take such genuine interest in an employee's mind rather than their appearance or connections. But none of them were prepared for what Remington Hayes was about to reveal. 3 days later, the intercom crackled with the summons that made Leah's blood turn to ice. "Miss Carter, please report to my office immediately." She knew this was it. Termination, possibly criminal charges, definitely the end of her precarious financial stability. The elevator ride to the executive floor felt like ascending to her own execution. Each floor that passed brought her closer to facing the consequences of her midnight literary conversations. The elevator was lined with mirrors that reflected her anxiety back from every angle. Pale face, trembling hands, the cheap polyester uniform that marked her as an interloper in this world of wealth and power. When Margie ushered her into Remington's office with unexpected gentleness, Leah found herself face to face with the man whose privacy she had invaded. Remington Hayes stood silhouetted against floor-to-ceiling windows, tall and imposing in his perfectly tailored suit. The Seattle skyline stretched behind him, like a kingdom he ruled with absolute authority. The Space Needle, Elliott Bay, the mountains in the distance, all seeming to bow to his presence. When he turned, his steel-gray eyes seemed to see straight through her pretenses to the frightened young woman beneath. "Miss Carter," he said, gesturing to a chair. "Please sit." Leah perched on the edge of the leather chair, her spine rigid with terror. The office was a monument to success. Awards from tech magazines, patents bearing his name, photos with world leaders and industry titans. First edition books worth more than her annual salary displayed like trophies. Everything reminded her of the vast gulf between their worlds. Here was a man who had built an empire from nothing, while she couldn't even manage to build a stable life with a Stanford education. "I suppose you're wondering why I called you here." Remington continued, settling behind his mahogany desk. "I've been reviewing security footage from the library." Her heart plummeted. This was it. "I've watched you there night after night these past several weeks." He touched something on his desk, a tablet displaying clear footage of Leah in the library. But instead of the accusatory evidence she expected, the video showed something entirely different. Leah meticulously organizing books, carefully dusting shelves, treating each volume with reverent care. The footage told a story she'd never seen from the outside. How she paused to read spines, how she grouped authors by theme and time period, how she handled each book as if it were a precious artifact. Watching herself, she saw not the intruder she felt like, but someone who genuinely cared for these literary treasures. "I'm sorry," Leah whispered, tears threatening to spill. "I know I shouldn't have been reading your books. I just wanted the books in their right places. I couldn't bear to see them neglected." "You don't understand." Remington interrupted, his voice carrying an emotion she couldn't identify. "You've been my eyes." The words hung in the air like a revelation. Leah stared at him in confusion, trying to process what he meant. "For months, I've been struggling to maintain my connection to my library," he continued. Books had been misfiled, covers damaged, the organization system I'd spent years perfecting slowly falling apart. My previous cleaning staff treated them like objects to be dusted and moved. But then you arrived, and suddenly everything was not just clean, but understood. He stood and walked to a bookshelf, running his fingers along the spines with practiced familiarity. You don't just organize books, Miss Carter. You curate them. You know which authors belong together, which themes connect across centuries, which volumes are meant to be companions. You've created conversations between texts that I never saw before. Placing Toni Morrison next to William Faulkner, connecting Virginia Woolf with James Joyce, creating dialogues across time and culture. I don't understand why that matters to you. Leah admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Remington was quiet for a long moment, his back still turned to her. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken truths. When he finally spoke, his words changed everything. Because I'm going blind, Miss Carter, and soon I won't be able to see any of this anymore. The confession hit Leah like a physical blow. This man who commanded boardrooms and built tech empires, who seemed to control everything around him, was facing the loss of the one thing he treasured most: his ability to read, to learn to connect with the world of ideas that had shaped his success. The doctors call it Stargardt disease. He continued, turning back to face her. Genetic, progressive, irreversible. I have perhaps 18 months before my central vision is completely gone. Already I'm struggling with fine print, losing details that once seemed so clear. I'm so sorry. Leah breathed, and meant it with every fiber of her being. What had started as a terrifying confrontation was becoming something profoundly heartwarming, a moment of genuine human connection across seemingly impossible barriers. I don't want sympathy, he said. I want partnership. Your notes, the ones you've been leaving in my books, they show me perspectives I never considered. You see connections I miss, understand nuances that escape me. You write about literature the way I think about technology, finding patterns, making connections, seeing the bigger picture. For this shy girl who had spent years feeling worthless, hearing such words from someone she'd admired from afar was nothing short of inspirational. And in that moment, everything changed between them. Oh, why me? Leah asked, her voice trembling with disbelief. I'm just a cleaner. Exactly, Remington replied, moving closer. You see what others overlook. You understand what it means to be dismissed, undervalued, treated as invisible. That perspective, it's invaluable. The consultants I hire, the experts I pay thousands of dollars for literary analysis. They tell me what they think I want to hear. You tell me the truth. He walked back to his desk and pulled out a folder thick with papers. These are your notes, Miss Carter. All of them. I've been collecting them, studying them, learning from them. He opened the folder, revealing dozens of her handwritten literary analyses. This insight about Dickens using fog as a metaphor for social blindness, brilliant. Your connection between Jane Austen's social commentary and modern corporate culture, revolutionary. Your analysis of how Gatsby's green light represents the American dream's fundamental impossibility, it changed how I think about my own success story. Leah stared at the folder in amazement. She'd never imagined her midnight scribbles were being preserved, much less valued. Here were her thoughts on paper, thoughts she'd been too ashamed to share with professors, too intimidated to voice in seminars, too convinced of their worthlessness to speak aloud. I've been corresponding with literature professors at Yale, Harvard, Stanford, Remington continued. Sharing your insights without revealing your identity, of course. They're fascinated by what they call ground-level perspective. Literary analysis informed by real economic struggle rather than academic theory. Before she could respond, the office door burst open without warning. Pauline stood in the doorway, her face flushed with triumph and barely contained malice. Behind her, Margie appeared clearly distressed. I'm sorry, Mr. Hayes, Margie began. She insisted it was urgent. It is urgent. Pauline interrupted, striding into the office with aggressive confidence. Mr. Hayes, I've discovered that Miss Carter has been stealing confidential company documents. Leah's world tilted. That's absolutely not true. I'm afraid the evidence says otherwise. Pauline continued, producing a manila folder with flourish. I found these in her personal locker during a routine security inspection. She opened the folder, revealing photocopies of emails, security reports, and what appeared to be sensitive financial documents. Remington's expression went Arctic cold as he examined the papers. These are very serious accusations, Ms. Ross. The most serious kind, Pauline agreed, barely containing her satisfaction. Corporate espionage disguised as literary enthusiasm. I believe she's been using her access to your library to photograph confidential documents and steal trade secrets. Think about it, Mr. Hayes. A desperate literature graduate with crushing debt, suddenly showing romantic interest in a billionaire's private study. The word romantic hit Leah like a slap. Had her intellectual connection with Remington been so obvious, so transparent that even Pauline could weaponize it? I've never seen those papers before in my life, Leah said desperately. Someone planted them there. Of course you'd claim that, Pauline sneered. But Mr. Hayes, surely you can see the pattern. A failed literature graduate with crushing debt suddenly showing interest in your private library. It was never about books. It was about information she could sell to your competitors. The accusation was so outrageous, so completely contrary to everything Leah believed about herself, that for a moment she couldn't even speak. The injustice of it, to have her genuine love of literature twisted into something mercenary and dishonest, felt like a violation of her very soul. Remington studied the documents with the intensity that had made him billions. Something about them troubled him. The timing, the convenience, the way they had surfaced just as he was beginning to trust Leah. His business instincts, honed by decades of detecting corporate deception, were screaming that something was wrong with this picture. Ms. Ross, he said slowly, you mentioned a routine security inspection. Who authorized this search? I did, of course. As cleaning team manager, I have full authority over staff. Actually, Remington interrupted, you don't. All employee searches require HR approval and security oversight. When exactly did this inspection take place? Pauline's confidence flickered. Yesterday morning around 4 a.m. And you were here at 4 a.m. because I often come in early to prepare for the night shift schedules. Remington reached for his phone. Margie, please have security pull all footage from the cleaning staff area for the past week. Focus specifically on locker access between midnight and 6 a.m. Mr. Hayes. Pauline began, her voice losing its earlier conviction. Surely that's unnecessary. The evidence is clear. On the contrary, he replied, his tone carrying the weight of absolute authority. It's essential that we get to the complete truth. Miss Carter's reputation and livelihood are at stake. If she's innocent, she deserves vindication. If she's guilty, we need ironclad proof. 20 minutes later, they sat in the security office watching footage that told a very different story. The timestamp showed Tuesday, 3:47 a.m. A figure in a cleaning uniform approached Leah's locker, glanced around nervously, then opened it with what appeared to be a master key. The person quickly slipped something inside, closed the locker, and hurried away. Dane Thompson, manning the security station, enhanced the image with practiced skill. I've been doing this for 15 years, he said quietly. We've seen all kinds of people do all kinds of things when they think nobody's watching. Rich folks, poor folks, desperate folks, greedy folks. But this, he shook his head. This is just plain mean-spirited. Slowly, unmistakably, Pauline's face emerged from the grainy footage. The silence was deafening. Pauline's face had gone chalk white, her earlier arrogance crumbling completely. "I can explain," she began weakly. "The footage explains quite enough." Remington set his voice like winter steel. 8 years of employment, Ms. Ross. 8 years during which I trusted you to manage staff with integrity and fairness. And you repay that trust by attempting to destroy an innocent person's life out of petty jealousy. What followed was swift justice for this shy girl who had nearly lost everything to someone else's malice. The truth, when it finally emerged, was both devastating and liberating. Security will escort you from the building immediately. Remington continued his decision, final and absolute. Margie will have your final paycheck ready within the hour. And Ms. Ross, if you ever attempt to contact Miss Carter or spread lies about her character, you'll discover exactly how protective I can be when defending people who matter to me. As security led Pauline away, her protests echoing down the marble hallway, Remington turned to Leah. The young woman sat in stunned silence, processing the emotional whirlwind of terror, vindication, and something she couldn't quite name. "Miss Carter," Remington said gently, "I owe you several apologies for doubting you even briefly, for allowing someone under my roof to terrorize you, for not recognizing sooner what was happening." "You don't owe me anything," Leah whispered. "You saved my job, my reputation, everything I have left." Actually, he smiled, and it transformed his entire face from intimidating CEO to something warmer, more human. "I was hoping to offer you a completely different position." Leah looked up, confusion clear in her eyes. "Personal librarian and literary consultant," he continued. "Your office would be my library, the space you've already made your own through your care and understanding. Your responsibility would be to help me maintain my connection to literature as my vision fades. To read with me, discuss ideas with me, help me see books through your remarkable perspective." He leaned forward, his expression earnest. "I've spent millions on consultants, advisors, experts, literary scholars with impressive credentials, critics with prestigious awards, professors with decades of experience. But none of them see literature the way you do, as living, breathing conversations across time. You don't just read books, Leah. You understand them. You make them speak to each other." He named a salary that was more than triple her current wages, enough to pay off her student loans, to live with dignity, to pursue the intellectual life she'd always dreamed of, but never dared hope for. But more than the money, it was the recognition that took her breath away. Someone saw her mind as valuable. Someone wanted to pay her to think. "There's more," Remington continued. "The Hayes Literary Foundation is launching a new initiative, bringing literature to underserved communities, funding literacy programs, supporting working-class voices in academia. I'd like you to help design and lead it. Your experience, your perspective on economic barriers to education, it's exactly what we need." "I don't understand," she said. "Why would you trust someone like me with something so important to you?" "Because," Remington said, settling into the chair beside her, "when you thought no one was watching, you treated my books like sacred objects. Because your mind makes connections that trained scholars miss. Because you understand that true intelligence isn't about credentials. It's about curiosity, empathy, and the courage to share your insights even when you think no one cares." From across the security office, Dane Thompson spoke up with a knowing smile. "Told you the quiet ones write the most important chapters." "Then let me be your voice." Leah said the words coming from some deep well of courage she didn't know she possessed. "Your reader. If you're losing your sight, Then let me be your eyes." Their gazes met. His steel gray and surprisingly vulnerable, hers, brown and bright with newfound purpose. In that moment, something shifted between them, a connection that transcended employer and employee, reader and listener, the powerful and the invisible. "For the first time since my diagnosis," Remington said quietly, "I'm not afraid of the darkness ahead." "And for the first time in my life," Leah replied, "I feel truly seen." It was an inspirational moment that would change both their lives forever. Proof that sometimes the most heartwarming connections come from the most unexpected places. But there was more. As they sat in that security office surrounded by the aftermath of Pauline's deception, Remington pulled out his phone. "Margie, I need you to call our legal department. I want a formal apology letter sent to every employee explaining what really happened here today. Miss Carter's character has been called into question, and I want the record set completely straight." He turned back to Leah. "I also want you to know that the other cleaning staff members have been asking about you. Apparently, you've been helping several of them with their own educational goals, writing recommendation letters, editing college applications, sharing books. They're furious about what Pauline tried to do." But their story was just beginning. 6 months later, the library had become the heart of something beautiful and transformative. Where Leah had once crept through shadows with a cleaning cart, she now sat in comfortable armchairs beside Remington's desk, surrounded by carefully selected books and the warm glow of late afternoon sunlight streaming through tall windows. The transformation was remarkable. Custom bookshelves lined the walls, organized according to Leah's innovative system that grouped texts by thematic conversations rather than traditional categories. Philosophy spoke to fiction, poetry answered to memoir and contemporary works, engaged in dialogue with classics across centuries and cultures. "Shall we continue with Morrison?" Leah asked, opening Beloved to their bookmark. "In a moment," Remington replied, leaning back with the relaxed posture of a man who had found unexpected peace. "I wanted to share something with you first." His vision had continued to deteriorate exactly as predicted, but rather than the anger and desperation Leah had expected, she'd watched him transform. He had become more present, more connected, more genuinely alive than she'd ever imagined possible. The man who once consumed information like a machine now savored each story, each poem, each carefully chosen word. "The Literary Foundation received another inquiry about your essay series," he continued. "Your analysis of social class in Victorian literature has been referenced in several academic papers. Harvard wants to know if you'd consider guest lecturing next semester." Leah blushed. When Remington had suggested she formalize her literary insights, she'd never imagined anyone beyond him would read them. But he'd begun sharing her work with scholars and institutions, and her reputation was growing in directions she'd never dreamed possible. The shy girl who once felt invisible was becoming a respected voice in academic circles. "There's something else," Remington said, reaching for a thick envelope on his desk. "The Hayes Literary Foundation wants to offer you a full scholarship to pursue your PhD. Any university, any program. We believe your perspective on literature, informed by real struggle, real understanding of class dynamics, is exactly what academia needs." Leah stared at the envelope, hardly daring to believe it. A PhD had been her secret dream, the one she'd abandoned when reality crashed into her idealistic plans. Now here it was, offered freely, no strings attached, except her own commitment to learning and growing. "The foundation has also approved funding for your community literacy program," he continued. "We're partnering with Seattle Public Libraries to offer literature circles in low-income neighborhoods, led by working-class voices like yours. People who understand that great books aren't just for people with trust funds. I still can't believe people value my thoughts, she admitted. Leah, he said, using her first name as he had for months now. You need to understand something. Your perspective, shaped by struggle, informed by empathy, sharpened by genuine love of literature. That's exactly what the academic world needs. Your insights are inspirational to scholars who've spent years in ivory towers, but never experienced the social dynamics they study. Through the library windows, they could see Dane making his evening rounds. At 70, he moved with the steady purpose of someone who had found deep contentment in simple service. He'd become an unexpected mentor to both of them, often stopping by with insights gleaned from years of observing human nature. Sometimes he'd bring books from his own collection, worn paperbacks that he'd read dozens of times, their margins filled with his own thoughtful observations. You know what I've learned, Leah said, closing the book and looking directly at Remington. When I was cleaning these floors, I thought I was invisible because I wasn't important enough to be seen. But I was actually invisible because people chose not to look past the uniform. And now I understand that being truly seen isn't about being in the spotlight. It's about finding someone who recognizes your worth and gives you space to grow into it. It's about discovering that the most heartwarming connections often happen quietly between people who understand each other's hearts. Remington reached across the space between them, finding her hand with the practiced ease of someone who had learned to navigate the world through connection rather than sight. For the first time, I'm not afraid of losing my vision, he said quietly. Because I've learned to see through your eyes. And for the first time, Leah replied, squeezing his fingers gently, I feel visible. Outside in the hallway, Margie paused in her evening tasks, smiling as she overheard their conversation. She had watched this transformation unfold day by day,